Rounding out our work on the global economy, this lecture focuses on the WTO and on global trade more broadly. As with the previous lectures, I don't aim to cover every concept in the textbook, but instead to discuss those ideas that I think will help our understanding. With that in mind, let's start out with a bit of trade theory before plunging into the details of the GATT and, as of 1995, the World Trade Organization. Well, there are many reasons why people might trade and might want to trade. But usually, in the economic literature, there are three that are predominant. The first is pretty straightforward. It's referred to as absolute efficiency or absolute advantage. There are some things that are just absurdly inefficient to produce in one place. Canada could grow cotton, but the consequences would not be good, and the energy and the resources lost to it would be pretty ridiculous. Better to trade for that. Other places, too, simply don't have something, oil for example, and need to trade for it. This is the absolute efficiency or absolute advantage argument, and it's pretty straightforward conceptually. The second one is a little bit trickier. It's the concept of comparative gains or comparative advantage. You could do everything, but wouldn't it be best to specialize and get really efficient in one key sector? Yes, theoretically, the US could grow flowers. They could, in principle, grow those flowers maybe a little bit more efficiently than Colombia can, simply because we have better resources and better technology and faster roads and faster planes here. But really, wouldn't it be better to focus on the stuff we do well, high tech for instance, and leave growing flowers to Colombia and trade for them instead? And the third one is economies of scale. At any given point of technological innovation, you might be able to multiply production 2 times while costs go up less than 2 times. This is the concept of economies of scale. But it only makes sense if you have a market big enough to multiply production to that new, higher efficient scale. By trading, you get that larger market that makes economies of scale more efficient. All of these, of course, assume that politics are a non-issue, which in the real world they basically never are. But let's say it is so just for now. We have 3 key ideas that help us understand the gains to trade. And it helps understand, too, why, in general, trade is a good deal even for the world's poorer countries. While it's better to build computers and trade for t-shirts than to do it the other way around, theory tells us that the t-shirt makers are better off with trade than without trade. Of course, the fact that this is generally so does not mean that everybody benefits. As Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has put it, theory says there will be losers, both within a country in the form of regional inequality and on a global scale. The question then is how to maximize the gains and minimize the losses. Generally, we know some of the areas that suffer losses. These are places like Appalachia in the United States, a region that has suffered from growing regional inequality, partly due to trade. We know this also from lots of other regions in the world, different parts of China, the so-called peripheral regions of Europe, which have had a very, very hard time as the big capitals, the big poles, have attracted lots of the investment and lots of the trade. So, what do you do in order to maximize the gains and minimize the losses? Well, traditionally, there are 2 bodies of theory which guide how we approach and how nations approach trade. These are modernization theory and dependency theory. For modernization theorists, development goes through stages like a child into adulthood. Trade is essential to growth and maturity. Developing countries can only grow by fully integrating themselves into the global trade system. Trying to disrupt that process, in the classic canons of modernization theory, is disruptive and not helpful. On the other side, you have dependency theorists. who classically have tended to argue that free trade is a losing deal for poor countries. First, they face foreign competition from giants, big firms, big countries with a big head start. Two, if they try to train their own labor force to compete, they risk losing those skilled laborers to outmigration, or through what is colloquially called the brain drain. The huge head start in the global north means that in free trade, they're always going to be taking one step forward, two steps back. How to deal with this? Well, dependency theorists focused on practices such as import substitution. Developing countries, poorer countries, should not import anything they can make for themselves. They should exercise capital controls, limiting the amount of money that can flow out of national banks in order to make sure they don't lose investment really, really quickly. They should selectively nationalize foreign industries. In other words, a foreign company sets up a factory in a developing country. Under international law, it is perfectly legitimate for that government, the poorer country's government, to nationalize and to claim that factory as their own, provided, of course, they compensate the company whose property it was. Well, dependency theorists argue that if you apply these three kinds of measures, trade will follow when you are big and strong enough to survive with the giants with whom you have to deal in the world economy. Now, what's important to understand here is that this does not mean that dependency theorists are anti-trade or anything like that. They are, however, skeptical of the value of too quick an insertion into the global economy of free trade. In the 1950s and 60s, a block of countries develops called the Non-Aligned Movement, or the NAM, basically focused on dependency theory-like solutions to their problems. They seek an economic policy approach that's somewhere between state socialism and US-led capitalism. Their main differences are in the realm of economic policy, much to the consternation of the US. After the 1973 oil shock, though, many of these countries are going to be saddled with a lot of debt very quickly, and they're going to ask the IMF and the World Bank for help. And as we saw previously in the lecture on the IMF, this isn't always going to be so simple, since one of the conditions for receiving that help is going to be opening up their markets to free trade. At the time, 1973 or so is where we are on the chronology right now. The major trade agreement guiding global trade policy is the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. The GATT's an agreement, not an institution. So it's not really able to act quickly or efficiently. It is kind of a rich country club, even though formally it does make efforts at being formally democratic. De facto, the agenda tends to get set by the rich countries. And trade agreements operate on the principle of non-discrimination. This is actually a key article for the GATT. Outside of regional trade blocs like the European Union or like NAFTA, the GATT principle is that what you do for one country, you must do for all. If the US lowers tariffs on textiles from Bangladesh by 3%, we must lower tariffs on textiles from all other countries by 3%. This principle of non-discrimination is going to be very, very important. Well, the GATT, as we said, is in effect in the 1970s and 1980s. It, however, is not very effective as a tool of increasing trade, and especially for poor countries then getting involved in the global free trade system. Indeed, there are multiple issues that the GATT framework can't really address. For example, subsidies are a big issue. Some countries subsidize key industries and key areas the way we do for agriculture in the United States. Other countries feel that this is an unfair practice. You're basically giving cash to some industries and letting them produce products at, in real terms, a lower price. Of course, since the GATT can't formally take decisions without all of these different finance ministers and trade ministers agreeing, you can guess that this is kind of a hard issue to overcome. The countries that are doing the subsidies and are providing the subsidies simply don't want to get rid of them, and the countries that aren't providing the subsidies and want to see them abolished can't really force the issue. Likewise, there are lots of sensitive areas that are very tricky to liberalize. Pharmaceuticals are a very protected area precisely because national governments tend to put a lot of money into the pharmaceutical research. That means that poorer countries that don't have such a developed industry are kind of left out in the cold. If they try to compete in pharmaceuticals, they're not going to be able to get access to those rich country markets. Agriculture, a little bit of the same story. But by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the need for a new framework is becoming obvious. The GATT is jokingly referred to as the General Agreement to Talk and Talk, in other words, highlighting the fact that things really aren't getting done. And it's here that we're going to get to the Uruguay round of the GATT and its transformation into a brand new organization, the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is an institution and has decision-making powers. There is a tribunal. They can make decisions on trade disputes. When they do so, those decisions become part of international law. The WTO is guided by the overarching purpose of always favoring increased trade. No matter what the human costs and no matter what the other political and societal costs. Reforms in WTO negotiations are organized on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. This is known as the single undertaking, which is designed to bring closure to contentious and long-standing debates. If two countries present themselves before the WTO with a trade dispute, the WTO can act by, well, first trying to get them to agree, but if that doesn't work, authorizing retaliatory sanctions on the country found not to be respecting trade laws. In other words, if you present yourself towards the WTO and the WTO finds you to be in the wrong, and that your actions cost, let's say, $5 billion worth of global trade, it can authorize the country that's complaining about your behavior to erect tariffs against your exports worth $5 billion. It's basically almost a form of controlled retaliation. All of these features of the WTO system, and while there are some good ones about them, are going to have a lot of strange and paradoxical effects. And one of them is to limit the environmental, food, safety, and other kinds of laws a country can put into place. Let me give you a simple example, which is also probably one of the most notorious examples. In 1990, the United States passed an amendment to the Clean Air Act. This was an act that initially had been passed by President Nixon back in the early 70s. President George H.W. Bush passed an amendment to it. And one of the things it did was place fairly tight emissions controls and fairly tight pollution restrictions on imported gasoline. In particular, the object was to target gasoline exporters, like Venezuela, that, in the US opinion, weren't living up to their environmental commitments. Problem: by not putting these same restrictions on US gasoline producers, Venezuelans, or the Venezuelan government, complained that this was a double standard. They went to the Dispute Resolution Unit of the WTO and complained. The Dispute Resolution body convened a panel, judged the issue, and found the US to be in violation of the WTO rules, guides, and statutes. Why? Because we were treating domestic gasoline producers differently from Venezuelan gasoline producers. Now, On the one hand, you can look at a situation like this and say, well, look, it's only fair. What you do for one, you must do for all. On the other hand, though, the effect of this was to create a situation in which we have more air pollution, which is not exactly a good thing, as a result of the structure and the nature of the WTO agreement. The effect of this ruling was that Congress had to lift the clean air requirements on Venezuelan imported gasoline and just live with more pollution. This gives you a general idea of how the WTO works and of some of the issues that tend to come up in the structure of the agency. By privileging trade always and forever, the WTO winds up in some cases taking decisions that aren't necessarily for the common good. The obvious question is, why do countries agree to all of this? Well, the WTO system can be good. It gives you access to markets, it gives countries access to markets that they never thought they could access before. It gives them growth opportunities. It really does do some positive things. But it also limits a country's ability to set rules on its economy, which means it's basically giving up sovereignty in favor of trade. Sometimes this works, and sometimes this backfires, especially for poorer countries. Last but not least, if you're interested in understanding these issues further, and you'd like to approach them on a more human scale possibly, and on a less abstract and rule-based scale, I cannot too highly recommend that you go out and see Life and Debt, the wonderful film that really gets into the transformative power of the WTO and of WTO rules on one small country, Jamaica, and on the Jamaican economy. The film is, I'll be honest, pretty one-sided and pretty much a little bit, I would say, overly critical of globalization. And yet, at the same time, it definitely connects us to some very powerful truths about the way that smaller, poorer countries have a difficult time fitting into the global trade regime.